Quechua, but in fact it's Japanese and means chit-chat. So the concept is, as your colleague said, it's very simple. You have 20 slides. Each slide stays 20 seconds. So that means that you have 6 minutes, 40 seconds to finish your presentation and tell a story. And we have 7 stories today that will tell us about landscape, about why they are important. And after these 7 stories, we will have some time for discussion. So I'm not going to be very long. I'm going to start with the first of this story. And I can only control the first slide. After one, they go. So Andrea Vasquez. Andrea is an active member of the International Forestry Student Association, and she will show us who defines development and what is the meaning and the consequences of non-plus and cultural land-based definition. Andrea?
Thank you. Can you hear me? Yeah, great. Who do you think defines the model of development in a country? For me, development is one of those tricky terms because it will depend on whose perspective you are taking into account. And it took me a while to understand the nuance of this term. Everything started while I was deciding what to study. I always like nature and love all types of plants. So I think that influenced my decision of studying forestry. As an undergrad student in Peru, we have to take field classes. And in my wildlife class, in a community near to Iquitos, I had to conduct interviews with the local people to understand hunting practices in the area. I noticed then that although we had traveled so much around Peru in our different courses, we didn't know the people and the context they are embedded in. And I recognized that we didn't know, and so that took me a while, and all this idea of the context and indigenous peoples having a different concept what development means, it took me to understand that I was assuming that just good technology, access to the global market, and efficiency managing resources, it will be enough to achieve development. But development for whom? The Amazon is mostly seen as a source of natural resources, but at the same time is seen as home and life itself by hundreds of different indigenous peoples. Well, some people call these differences of development ethno-development or endogenous development because they are trying to differentiate themselves from the market globalized notions of development. So there are two competing expectations of what development means, indigenous peoples and non-indigenous peoples. And this is creating conflicts in Peru. So, for instance, political, environmental, ecological, and social conflicts. Actually, in the Peruvian Ombudsman, it is registered a monthly average of 228 social conflicts, and most of them are related to destruction of natural resources. So grassroots organizations, journalists, and respected academics identified that such conflicts are mostly and primarily driven by transnational corporations' models as businesses. So extraction or exploitation, production, consumption, and marketing of these products that are way beyond our planet ecological boundaries. Also, it has been documented that transnational corporations has the tendency to exploit nature under the name of development and progress, while externalizing liabilities to the communities and the environment. Furthermore, transnational corporations take part in the writing of public national policies regarding the management of the commons and shared resources. Well, there is an increase of rural and indigenous movements voicing the different perspectives of development. I mentioned these two types of development, right? Endogenous and ethno-development. So in the Amazon, indigenous peoples are articulating that the projects of development that are executed in their territories should take and should support their visions and desires for their future. And the way that they are doing this is through the creation of organizations that, indigenous organizations that will provide a means for them to support their visions and what actually desire for their future. Currently in Peru, there is an asymmetric struggle to address main powers, main transnational powers, so they respect the self-determined ethno-development of indigenous peoples. There has been some achievements, sadly at high cost of human lives. In 2009, there was a sadly success in what is called the Bawa Massacre, and it was a clash between military forces and the people. Well, the people was able to create enough pressure to the government to eliminate certain decrees that were threatening their desires for the future, well, their collective and individual visions after a free trade agreement signed with the US. Well, I was mentioning at the beginning that I wasn't getting to know actually the context of people and the people itself. So I decided to do something about that. Through a master's and a PhD now, we are forming alliances with Ashaninka and Jineyami peoples for the Peruvian Amazon to collaboratively research about what they envision for their futures. There are some evidence that suggests the necessity of establish meaningful and endogenous indicators of development, so are based in the context and culture. As well, it is important to recognize the recognition of a plurinational state in Peru and a practice of it. So these endogenous processes are vital in order to influence public policies in Peru and as a way to address current and future conflicts between humans and nature. Underlying all of these are two important values. First, respectful coexistence and reciprocity. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you very much, Andrea. Now we are going to move to the hopefully. Trying to open the presentation, obviously doesn't want. So I guess that while someone may try to fix that at the thing, maybe we move to the third presenter and we'll have the second later. There is not really order, in fact. So this one seems to be stuck also. Okay. Yes, sorry. So we are going to have the Saeed Ayam Ali, who will present. He is the CEO of the Crop for the Future, and he will tell us how we are going to feed the water world and how we are going to do that. So as soon as you are on stage, I will launch the presentation, hopefully.
Good evening. This is Planet A, and you and I and 7.3 billion people share Planet A with about 1 million animal species and 500,000 plant species. This is home, and there is no Planet B. We also have Plan A, and if we look at Plan A, that involves agriculture in which we use a tiny proportion of the biodiversity of the planet to feed 7.3 billion people. Wheat, rice, maize, and soya provide 75% of the world's food. Will those crops be sufficient to feed 10 billion people in the hotter climates of the future? Just take one crop, maize. Not only does maize feed people and provide food, it provides fodder, it provides animal feed, and increasingly it's a source of material for biofuels to feed our engines. Is this the basis on which we should be looking for agriculture for a hotter climate? Our diets are increasingly uniform, and we have ingredients that are shipped vast distances around the world from ingredients that are far from, to places where they are far from their centers of production to produce almost identical food across the planet for more and more people in the new developing countries. If we take Europe and Asia, we see supermarket aisles in which identical products are sold from very, very few species, transported long supply chains in which those supply chains are increasingly vulnerable to provide identical products across the planet. Now, in September, the United Nations announced the Sustainable Development Agenda, and 6 of those Sustainable Development Goals are related to agriculture. And we can see those goals in terms of agriculture, consumption, life on land, zero hunger, climate action, and partnerships for those goals. We need a Plan B that looks at agricultural diversification in terms of clean energy, in terms of sustainable and responsible production systems, in terms of diversification of land use and landscapes, and particularly new crops that can be used to diversify agriculture in the hotter climates. There is no Plan B for a +3 world. There is no Plan B for a +3 world. That means the crops we now use to produce the majority of the food on the planet will increasingly be under pressure, and the place where that pressure will occur will be in the developing tropics, in which we see the yields of the major crops decline, and we see other parts of the world, which are the major exporting regions, in which the yields of those crops will increase. What will we do in regions in which those crops can no longer be grown for the local production systems that increasingly depend on those long supply chains from elsewhere in the world? We need to find clever, intelligent diversification options for crops that are people's crops, that they grow themselves, but they have at the moment limited markets and limited external uses for those crops. We need to see how those crops can actually be intelligent options for us, because those crops contain nutrition, they contain ingredients in which we can actually find potential markets, and of course they are closer to the centers of production. They are people's crops, and we should find chains and opportunities to find new ways to develop those crops into crops that add to the major crops of the world. We can't just grow them in fields. We've got to find the whole research value chain in terms of growing the genetic resources of those crops, the proximate composition analysis, cuisines and desirable products that consumers in their markets actually want to have those crops, because not only are they marketable, they're nutritious. We need smart agriculture for landscapes that is climate smart and smart in terms of end uses for products that are more than just the 3 crops grown as monocultures around the world. They're giving us new opportunities, enormous opportunities for agriculture to diversify into a new paradigm. We take something like an intercrop here, enormous opportunities for us to use information technologies, new ways of looking at systems, remote sensing, modeling, and using those crops to find production and end uses closer to their markets to replace the major monocultures. In this case, you can see oil palm in the background. We need, now more than half the world lives in cities. We need agriculture to be in cities. We need to redefine our urban landscape to include agriculture from diverse production systems closer to those people who actually need those crops and can see the products from them. We've got to look at how we look at urban agriculture as a productive and economically sustainable and natural resource management system that uses new technologies, that uses new market opportunities in cities where the majority of people will live. Can we find agriculture that actually delivers just-in-time products to the end user within meters of the place those crops are being grown? Why do we use food crops to feed fuel engines? Why don't we use crops that grow on marginal lands, on saline soils, on poor soils, in which we can find feedstocks to find diverse uses of bioenergy beyond using the main crops over and over again? We can find on marginal soils a number of crops, and we can look at feedstocks in engine systems and gasification systems in which those crops not only will provide feedstock, they can provide green chemicals, they can provide biomaterials and end uses to diversify the entire agricultural system. Now, for all of this, we need an action plan, a global action plan for agricultural diversification that on Monday we will launch in Paris. We want you to sign that declaration, the Paris Declaration on Agricultural Diversification, to show that this is actually an opportunity for us to find green energy, to find sustainable production systems, to use the land and the landscapes in a more climate-smart system, and opportunities for us to find uses for crops, because Plan B is the +3 world for which we have no alternatives, because there is no Planet B. Thank you.
Thank you. Now we will have I think some sort of a malediction with the white arrow will probably be somewhere else. Ah, H. Sorry. Yes. So we'll have Uriya Judy. Uriya is a scientist in C4 working on climate change adaptation, and she will show us that once there was a lake.
Good evening. The story I would like to tell you today is about a lake, a beautiful lake in the middle of the desert in Tombouctou in northern Mali, the Lake Fagibine. This lake was providing livelihoods for different people, for pastoralists, fishermen, for women, for men, for children, and everybody was using the area around the lake. This lake was so important that some NGOs in the 80s decided to protect the edge of the lake with the prosopis. The prosopis tree, I think some people know that, is a very invasive species, but it's also a very drought-resistant species. So the lake was suddenly protected with these trees, but what happens in the 90s is that, unfortunately, this lake dried out. When this lake dried out, people lost their livelihoods. They lost the fishermen, they lost the fish, no agriculture, no pastoralists. And people were struggling how to deal with this change because it was a dramatic environmental change. What happens after that is that the prosopis, of course, took the area of the lake, and suddenly we have a forest. So it was a lake, and it became a forest. And can you imagine now people who were fishermen suddenly having prosopis forest, and they don't know what to do with this forest? That is what we wanted to understand, and we were there as a CIFOR scientists to understand the vulnerability of people, but also to understand their adaptive capacity. How do they deal with such a situation? We talked to women, to men, to young people, to old people, to understand the kind of the perception of the whole community. The first thing we found out, it was that the strategy of men is different from the strategy of women, because the first thing men did was to migrate here to the mining areas in the southern of the country, or in other countries like to Algeria or Mauritania or Libya. This strategy changed the whole structure of the villages, because then suddenly we had communities where we had women, some young men, kids and older people. So the whole social structure of the community changed when this strategy happened, when men migrate. So what we saw when we arrived there, that women had to take over a lot of activities which were in the past done by men. So we find out that their vulnerability actually increased because they are adapting to two things. They are adapting to the climate variability, but they are also adapting to the migration of man, which is an adaptive strategy. So we also find out that not only women and men are different, but also women were different, because some women couldn't do some strategies because they were culturally restricted in their mobility. They couldn't move to this forest, for instance, to use it. And what was interesting, that actually the poorest women in the society were the ones who could take advantage of these new resources, of the new ecosystem services, which were mostly wood and charcoal. We were not expecting to see that, because when you think on vulnerabilities, you think, oh, the poorest is the most vulnerable. And we were very surprised to find that is not true. Then, when we looked more in this process, we saw that charcoal production was taken by the poorest women, and it couldn't be used by other women because these women were in the higher class of the society, and they are not able to do charcoal. So suddenly they became the ones who are vulnerable in this new situation, while the poorest women could improve their livelihood, they could increase the food security and decrease their vulnerability. So their adaptive capacity was actually, in this situation, suddenly higher than other groups where they were the marginalized one in the past. So we have a completely shift in relations, in social relations. But what we found also is that even though the women, they had these autonomous adaptation strategies, the problem was that there is a lack of knowledge. Those women, they were all pastoralists or they were farmers, and suddenly they have to make charcoal. And we found out that extension services, but also other services were not themselves adapted to the change which happened in the society and in the environment. Also, in terms of market, the market was very far for those women, and they couldn't take advantages of this strategy. Even though they were engaged in producing charcoal, they had to sell it in the market in the village. In terms of land tenure, it was the same problem, because it's interesting, when the lake became a forest, the land tenure also changed, because forest is under the government, while the lake area was managed by communities. So people lost also their access, and suddenly those women were illegal, using charcoal illegal. What I mean here is that when we think in vulnerabilities, we need to unveil a lot of complexity at the local level. Communities are not the same. They are not a homogeneous group. They have different rights, different access, and this is what we need to understand deeply if we want to avoid maladaptive actions. We also need to understand the different roles which are related to different societal status or ethnic groups if we want to avoid to have also maladaptive actions, because we don't understand the pattern of vulnerabilities, which also are very dynamic, as I showed here. What I want to say here is that when we think landscape, we need to think two things. They are environmental lives, but they are also social lives of landscape. And those two lives are very important. They are linked to each other, and we need always to link them when we think vulnerability adaptation. We need also to overcome fragmentation in the knowledge. We need to build bridges between local communities, national stakeholders, between policy, between projects, but also always we need to understand the vulnerability at the local level because adaptation happens locally. I choose this picture, it's not from the Sahel, because I think that these thoughts or this experience is also maybe interesting for other regions or interesting wherever people interact with nature, because we shape nature, but also nature shapes social structures, shapes societies, and we need always to understand both of them. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Now we'll have assuming that I'm more successful than usual, no? I think it's a challenge for me. I mean, there's probably something, so they put a bug or something like that, just to keep you entertained. Well, okay, we'll have Michael Taylor. Michael is the CEO, the director of the International Land Coalition, and he will share with us a common vision, the 1065 Challenge.
Good evening. Have you ever wondered why policymakers choose a course of action that may have no basis in fact, and even when evidence might tell us to do exactly the opposite? This is a challenge that is faced by many of the 207 members of the International Land Coalition. The first decade of my career was spent working in the ministry of my government in Botswana that was responsible for cutting up and privatizing one of Africa's great ecosystems, the Kalahari Desert, and turning it into ranches. This was land on which tens of thousands of people lived and had their livelihoods, including the indigenous San people. My government's policy was based on the often held assumption that people will degrade common property and people will always overexploit resources that they share. The most productive use of land, therefore, was to hand it over to individuals or to private corporations. But it's simply not true. I witnessed the terrible human tragedy of large-scale land dispossession in my country. I also witnessed the environmental cost of fragmenting the landscape. As I read and I started linking with experts around the world, it became clear to me that the tragedy of the commons had long been debunked by science. Yet, many policymakers continue to believe it because it's convenient. It's convenient for powerful individuals and companies to put their own interests and their own concerns above those of the inhabitants of customary lands. To date, the Botswana government has ranched over 2 million hectares. But this is not a unique story. Globally, local communities and indigenous peoples claim 65% of the surface of this earth. Yet governments only recognize those claims on 10% of the surface. That puts 1.5 billion people who live on the face of our planet into the legal category of squatters. This is absolutely disenfranchising. In an agrarian society, being secure on your land cuts to the heart of both personal and shared preoccupations. How do I feed my family? How do we care for the environment that sustains us? How do we cope with climate change? How do we create a shared prosperity for our future? We're witnessing a massive shift in lands away from their customary owners. In the Land Matrix project, we've tracked 40 million hectares of large-scale transnational deals since 2008. That's about the size of Germany. And it's only the tip of the iceberg. It's time to reconsider. Paradigms are changing, yet decision makers so often seem stuck in the myths of yesterday, convenient as they are to the powerful who benefit from them. And choices based on these myths are often very hard to reverse. When local communities are empowered to control the customary lands they know best, the benefits often ripple way beyond the locality. To realize what International Land Coalition's members call people-centered land governance, we need to uproot these myths. And I'd like to share with you now 6 myth-busters that will help us make that change. Firstly, communities are the best custodians of the land. On average, state-protected areas are deforested 4 times faster than community-controlled forests. To give you an example, indigenous territories in the Amazon have 1/10 the deforestation rate of neighboring state-controlled forests. Secondly, community land rights enable sustainable development. Secure land rights increases incomes and contributes to a whole range of social indicators, from education to food security to health. Recognizing and enforcing land rights is a critical path to achieving more sustainable and equitable economic growth. Community empowerment, thirdly, can foster gender equality. When communities are making the decisions, it creates space for women to step into leadership positions. Why? Because women are often the primary users of natural resources. Secure land rights can be a stepping stone to greater gender equality. Fourthly, community land rights create new inclusive economic models. By controlling their biggest asset, their land, communities are able to decide on a future which is based on their own desires, their own priorities, and built on their own natural resource base. Communities can start deciding for themselves what development means. Communities make land more productive. While green grabs may treat land as a museum, land is not as healthy as when it's used responsibly. I recently visited a community in Thailand of 300 people, and their forests sequestered twice as much carbon per hectare as the neighboring untouched forest. Community control also reduces uncertainty as conflict. It enables local conflict mitigation strategies. Investors, in addition, are more likely to invest if there's in projects that carry minimal risk of local blockades, of their reputations being tarnished, of lawsuits, and of eventual abandonment. So a broad movement is coming together to change the existing dynamic. A global call to action is being launched in early 2016 by the International Land Coalition, Oxfam, and the Rights and Resources Initiative. Over 100 organizations so far have joined up with the aim of doubling the amount of land under community control by 2020. Yes, our target is ambitious, but it's only a start. We make this call as a matter of basic social justice, but we also make it as a pragmatic call to share and effectively manage our planet's resources. Rebuilding community lands is many times harder than preventing their loss in the first place. Doubling the amount of land controlled by indigenous peoples and local communities not only serve the interests of those communities themselves, they also help governments to increase their development, improve their development prospects, feed their people better, and provide investors with greater certainty. It's about people and creating a shared vision for our common future. The rightful custodians of customary lands are standing up to assert their rights and responsibilities. Together, we aim to double the amount of community land by 2020. We invite you to join the cause. Thank you.
I think we are doing pretty well. Now we'll have Tristan. Oh, that's a miracle. Tristan Lecomte, who is the co-founder of the Pure project, and he will show us how insetting via agroforestry at landscape level will benefit a lot of people and brings quite a lot of money too, isn't it?
Thank you very much. Good evening, everybody. So the story starts with Alter Eco Fairtrade Chocolate, a company I had founded in 1998. We wanted to offset all the products, and we wanted to do it in an integrated way, yet we had no clue. We wanted to plant within our supply chain, so this is how we came up with the term insetting. And Francisco Alegría Ruiz in Peru is one of the 2,000 cocoa farmers of Acopagro Cooperative. He had the answer, and together we started to plant trees within the cocoa field and around, to help his community and at the same time to offset the Alter Eco products. This is a situation that Francisco was facing when he was a coca farmer before producing cocoa. He faced severe land degradation issues like erosion, lack of organic matter in the soil, lack of revenues, lack of biodiversity to pollinate, for example, his fruital species, and lack of revenues. And this is a vision that we shared with Francisco and his fellow farmers to bring back the trees, agroforestry as you all know it, and to have multiple impacts on soil, on water, on biodiversity, and on farmers' revenues, on farmers' patrimony as well. Insetting via agroforestry at landscape level means not only planting within the fields, but as well around in the whole watershed of the supply chain to benefit the farmers, the planet, and the company which commits. We target slopes, hotspots, biodiversity hotspots, and as well we plant along the river stream to preserve water resources. And the benefits of insetting via agroforestry are really multiple and exponential for the corporate, for the planet, and the farmers. A one-time investment of 6,000 euro per hectare can generate up to 20,000 euro of ecosystem and economic services per hectare per year. This is world soil degradation today, so this is our roadmap. More than 2 billion hectares of land to regenerate thanks to, for example, insetting via agroforestry. And this is why I founded Pure Projet in 2008 to answer this take at large scale level. Today, in 8 years, we've planted 5 million trees, so we could be proud, but it's only half a day of deforestation. Every day, 10 million trees are being cut. So our question was how to scale up. And the how to scale up story starts with another chocolate product, this time a Ben & Jerry's ice cream, because they used to buy coconut from that same area, from Francisco and his fellow farmers. And so they engaged in the project to offset their footprint and helped us to go larger scale and longer terms, because our forest projects run on 40 years. So Francisco today and his fellow farmers, they have planted more than 3 million trees, only native and diversified species, which bring their shade and regenerate the soil and bring ecosystem and economic services to this farmer and help as well Ben & Jerry's and Alter Eco to strengthen their supply chain in quality and quantity. The farms are more resilient and the project is fully designed, developed, managed by the farmers themselves. Here you can see some monitoring or some trimming to maximize the farmers' benefits. These benefits are already directly visible, for example, on the cocoa yields, which increase naturally thanks to richer soil and optimized levels of shade. And as well, the farmers have started to harvest some timber, some fruits, some seeds, and even some honey as we help them to diversify their sources of income, all types of income that are linked with the forest. Their effort has gone even much beyond than that. They've succeeded to concession for conservation more than 400,000 hectares of virgin forest, which is located in the watershed area of all the cocoa fields, and all this to offset the Ben & Jerry's footprint. Now, this project is integrated into an 800,000 hectares model forest project, regenerating what is degraded and conserving what is left, and bringing this project to a regional and even to a national level. And next year, in 2016, normally in March, it will be declared as a biosphere area, as a biosphere reserve by UNESCO, on 2.4 million hectares, generating multiple benefits and valuing both the archaeological sites that are present there, as well as dynamizing economic activities. But when we have such a big land to protect now, we need to scale up again. So we need many more Ben & Jerry's to engage in insetting via agroforestry. Actually, our goal is to help companies to see their interdependence with nature. looking at their supply chains and looking at how their ecosystem are degraded and how it threatens their supply chain and their business on the long run. And they can engage in very long-term and massive projects. We talk about 10 million trees program over 5 years, for example, for Nespresso or Accor, to really help these beauties to stay alive and to get all the benefits for us and future generations. Here it's Francisco with one of the tree he planted and his son, and he says, what is this tree for? Well, it's for me, it's for my family, it's for my business, and it's for humanity. I think it's very well summarized. We shall all be more aware of our interdependence with nature. We are environmentalists to preserve humanity. We are not against us, we are preserving us. And we need to make insetting via agroforestry more known. We've created the international platform for insetting with many companies, certification bodies and NGOs, and you're all welcome to join this movement to integrate the climate stake more into our core activities, our core business. And what can you do today? You can plant a tree or millions of trees or billions of trees, because to offset the world footprint, we should plant 90 billion trees a year. So there is a lot of potential for all of us. Let's all engage in insetting via agroforestry for us and for the future generations. Thank you very much.
Merci.
Thank you.
This one, yeah. Now, Ninka Stam, who is the Senior Learning Manager for the Landscape and Deforestation at IDH Sustainable Trade Initiative, will explore how business initiative for sustainable landscape can reconcile production and conservation.
That's right. Thank you very much. Okay. Well, landscapes all have our interest, and there is a need for more integrated action towards landscapes. IDH is an organization that's worked in private sector supply chains, and we recognize that the private sector is a key driver of land use change. So also in these landscape approaches, they need to be part of the conversation. Now, is there a business case for businesses to get involved in protecting forest areas, in restoring? Yes, there is. And the business case is related to either long-term productivity of producing companies, and it's often related to reputational risk for companies that are sourcing from these landscapes. IDH in the past has worked mainly in the supply chains, and although interventions have been meaningful, especially focusing on social aspects, the natural resource side of these single supply chain interventions has been very limited, because there are always multiple stakeholders that are needed to address these cross-cutting issues like deforestation. Our new initiative is an initiative on sustainable landscapes. It's starting in 6 landscapes now, and there are 5 more coming. And I'd like to illustrate a bit the work that is being done by an example from Kenya. Now, Kenya, it's going to come up shortly. Kenya is a country that is producing a lot of tea, and the engagement of IDH has also been around the tea sector. In the Kenya landscape program, we're working in the southwest Mau forest, and the Mau forest complex is an important water tower in Kenya, so it's a region that is maintaining a lot of water resources for the country. And it's also a region that has been heavily deforested in the past 10 years, partially because of political handouts of land, but also because of population growth. Now, the tea sector is also important for the livelihoods of people in that region. And our initial work there, together with the tea companies and other stakeholders, of course, has been around providing livelihoods, intensifying tea yields, providing farmer field schools, not only focusing on tea, but also focus on diversification of livelihoods. So here you see examples of that, like poultry farming, rabbit farming, dairy farming intensification, to sustain the livelihoods of the growing population in the landscape. But there is an issue with the tea around Kericho, and that is related to changes in the microclimate. Because of deforestation, tea yields have reduced significantly, and the tea estates and also the smallholders are suffering from that. Changes in the microclimate and changes in the water availability in the region. Sometimes there are droughts, sometimes there are floods. So there's increasing momentum for the stakeholders to come together And that is what we've started to convene since 2014, working with the businesses, the communities, and the different governments of the different districts in the region to sit together and together make a plan, how are we going to save the forest, because we all recognize we need it. Now, of course, while planning and doing research into drivers of deforestation and what interventions may be needed, it was also important to keep the process practical. So the initiatives that were just easily started, we called them no-regret options, are related to tree planting, working with tree nurseries with the communities. And meanwhile, the strategy was formed with a group of stakeholders on what needed to be done. And that was related to maintaining and protecting the forest, improving governance of the forest, but also creating more sustainable livelihoods, sustainable energy options, because also the tea sector consumes a lot of energy for tea drying, and water conservation. Now first and I'm going to tell you a bit about the interventions that we're looking into now with the stakeholders that we can co-fund and for which we're mobilizing additional investors to make that work over the longer term. These relate first to putting in a physical barrier or creating more buffer zones for communities where they can have the benefits of the forest without having to go into the forest. But also better governance is needed, not only depending on the Kenya Forest Service, but also on multiple stakeholders collaborating in monitoring the forest, because there is still a lot of charcoal production and a lot of people entering the forest illegally, which is causing forest degradation. Besides that, new energy solutions are being needed. So alternatives are being sought after and are now being promoted by the coalition. Related to household energy, but also more efficient use of energy in the tea sector. A third important element is going to be related to intensification of dairy farming, because there's a lot of cattle entering the forest to graze, which is leading to forest degradation. And with support, communities are now entering dairy farming systems where they have more production and more yields per head of cattle. Water availability is also important. The communities need water that is coming from the forest, but it's drying up. So protection of springs and wells is also a key intervention, and hotspots are now being protected with this type of well protection schemes. And of course, as a water tower, protection of the forest is important for the hydropower companies that are generating power from the water that is coming from this landscape. So also the hydropower companies are part of this coalition, are investing in forest restoration for their own good. So actually this work has led to the realization of all these different groups of stakeholders that they depend on the Mau Forest Complex for the long-term productivity within the region. And also them conversing together has led to this plan of action and also more focused mobilization of resources to start addressing this. So it's one of our pioneering landscapes, and it's very promising to see that this business case, although many people argue that it's not there, is actually being strongly recognized by these global companies that are producing in the region and is being acted upon by these practical examples in the field. And it's all multi-stakeholder work, so it's the companies, the communities, and the government closely collaborating. And I think that is a very promising signal, and I hope that we together can mobilize many more of these types of interventions going forward. So this is the slogan of the people that are in the Mau Forest Complex. It's building our flourishing future. And I hope that that is an effort that we can all try and replicate and learn from in the future. Thank you.
Thank you. So now we are moving to the last presentation for tonight. I thought also, always surprised if it worked at the end. I think that this thing seems to have a life on its own. When something is beeping at the same time, I don't know if it's going to explode or not. Ah, here we are. Now, we have Nolan Hunter, who is the CEO of the Kimberley Land Council, and will highlight how, via traditional fire management, indigenous people lead climate change mitigation.
Okay. So we're in an area, northern Australia, which accounts for a big area of savanna burning. The Kimberleys is an area in northwestern Australia where we carry out a savanna burning project, which we want to talk to you about in terms of mitigation. Fire, people think of fire and they think about all the bad things. In the Kimberleys, we have really hot fires, higher fuel load density in hot summer months, and it can be destructive. But you can manage it, and we've developed a methodology using traditional fire management. Historically, Aboriginal people were carrying out fire management and until settlement, when that stopped because people were moved off their lands. But historically, they had a way of managing fire. This project allows people to get back out on country and to start the process again where they're integrating fire management, traditional fire practice, with a method for creating the management of fire, going out doing fire burns on country. We use our rangers, biodiversity rangers. There's a cycle in terms of what we do as a method, looking at mitigation. How do we set up a process so that we can get the benefits of carbon abatement credits? And our groups are using fire differently. There's all different types of fires. Not all fires bad. What we do is we look at cool fire burns in cooler months rather than the hot summer burns. We can control the fire and we can contain it. And we can contain or regulate the emissions differently to a hot fire burn. What's different about this is that our traditional owner groups use our native title rights recognition to run this project. It's different for us in Australia, and the difference is that we get all of the benefits that are created out of the carbon abatement plus the benefits of the management and ownership of the process. Here you can see our groups do a lot of planning around it. They look at the information, the historic information, the previous year's fire burns. They look at all the science information, the cultural data that they need to plan about how to undertake the fire burning. A lot of the Kimberleys, it's remote areas, 420,000 square kilometres. We have some rough roads. A lot of it's inaccessible. You can only go so far with the roads, and people will get out on country and reconnect with country is the other benefit that we can get. The other way we do it is by air, by helicopter. So you have to go out because you can't access it any further by road or by sea. So you get up on a helicopter and they use this device, an incendiary device that drops a pellet and to start strategic fires all along. From that you can see this is what they call mosaic burning. It's a controlled burn. You create the fire breaks in a strategic way so that when you get the late season fire burns, they're not going to burn as high or as out of control as they normally would if you had a higher fuel density load. Here you can see the rangers, the community people here using the modern technology of satellite tracking to monitor the fires that they set. They can pretty much manage those fires and know exactly what's happening. They've got to look at and they've got to understand the wind conditions, a whole range of other conditions that affect the way the fire operates. Here you can see the difference between fires that are in the blue areas that have been burned strategically and a few pockets of red here and there. It would have looked a lot different had it been not managed properly and not controlled in the way that they've done strategically with this fire process. The result of this is that you can reduce the emissions between cool fire burns and high fire burns in terms of the emissions that are going, the CO2 and the heat emissions into the atmosphere. And of course the benefit is that we're doing our bit for mitigation and we're controlling the effect of fire. The result of that is that we can protect our flora and fauna, our livelihoods, our sustainability, protection of those species or other types of vegetation that would otherwise be destroyed and sometimes gone forever if the fires are so hot in terms of the damage that they can produce. The other benefits are that our ranger groups develop conservation biodiversity type ranges. You create employment and jobs for people out there. It's reconnecting people to their countries and their lands. The cultural connection is really important. So this has other benefits around strengthening their ties to land. Here the Gouldian finch threatened species whose habitats can be quite easily destroyed by high fires and perhaps gone forever. So some of those pockets of areas in the Kimberleys, if the fire continues the way it does, threats to species like this that are threatened species like the Gouldian finch will disappear. We have rock art sites around the area which also can be damaged by high fires. So this is also critical and important in terms of people's cultural places and areas of significance. So these are the benefits of looking after different things. We do a comparison of the savanna burning and we look at the way in which other parts of the world and the globe have other savannas that also have burns. We are very interested in the transferability of this methodology and this savanna burning project that we're doing because we think it has application in other parts of the world. So all of the benefits that we can get from managing our country and using our cultural values and knowledge and the link between Western science and cultural knowledge leads to the ongoing sustainability and our future interests for our people and the next generation. So, thank you.
Great. We have had 7 fantastic presentations. Now some people are moving to set up the scene. And I will ask our 7th speaker to come as soon as you will see 7 chairs here. And we'll have a short round of question and answer with the audience. In the meantime, I ask you to think about your question. You can turn to your closest neighbor and ask, discuss, see what question you want to ask. And if we can get some light, because then I can see you, because no. Okay, so I can ask now 7 speakers to come. And I guess there will soon be enough chair for you to be sitting.
Should I go or not?
Do it in secret.
It's a free sitting.
Bright lights.
Yeah.
Okay, I know it's late, but if people have questions, I mean, we have half an hour. So there are mics here, so if you have a question, you just stand up, you go to the closest microphone, you tell who you are, and you ask your question. Yes, I see one lady over there. Yeah.
My name is Odile Hugonow-Heber, and I am with the Women International League for Peace and Freedom. This afternoon I heard a lot about reforestation, and nobody seems to have a strategy on stopping the cutting of the forest, the Amazon, just stopping it. I mean, we have to stop it, not just reforest once it's destroyed. So I know some of you, I think especially Tristan, but other people had some kind of strategy. Can you focus a little more on that? Thank you.
Shall I answer? Yeah. Thank you very much. Yeah, maybe it was not clear, but in the project that I presented you, we helped the farmers first to replant what was degraded because they were coca farmers, and as well then they planted coffee and cocoa, and so it's agroforestry, but as well there was a big piece of land of almost 400,000 hectares that was owned by the government. It's virgin forest, primary forest, and inside there was illegal logging, illegal gold mining, and dynamite fishing. And so indeed, that's why we wanted to help, the communities wanted to take this land under concession, which we have helped them and they have succeeded to do so. So now they are engaged to preserve these 400,000 hectares for 40 years. And so they develop community-based watch and they become forest guardians within the community. And as well, we help them develop alternative economic activities, like honey production, which I showed, or fish breeding, or diversification of revenues not linked with timber to reduce the pressure on the forest. And all this is funded by a REDD+ project, certified VCS and CCBA, sorry for all the acronyms, but it's to give you the technical terms. And so there is a methodology that exists already today to preserve forests. It's called REDD, Reduced Emission from Deforestation and Degradation, which allows, thanks to the sale of the credits generated by the reduction of deforestation, to fund these activities which are community-based and which help the communities to manage their own land, in our case, because there is a big debate about REDD+. Sometimes it's being used by some companies or private interest to kick out the local population from certain areas. So it's certainly not our case, as it's fully community-based.
Yes, please.
Yeah, I think the kind of initiatives that you've described are very much part of the process. And what we would emphasize from the point of view of the members of the International Land Coalition is the essential precondition is recognizing community rights. Indigenous peoples are standing up here at the climate change negotiations and are saying, we've looked after this world's biodiversity, we've looked after this world's carbon storage, we've looked after this world's storage, this world's heritage of forests and other ecosystems. And the fact that the world is not recognizing our rights to these is undermining our ability today to do that. So recognizing those rights and securing those rights in the names of local communities is not the end of the story, but it's certainly the beginning of the story where that's not the case.
I would like to add something. Totally, that's the direction that we should move on, and the industrialization of the forests totally are going against what indigenous perspectives are telling us about what they desire for their futures. In fact, for a lot of indigenous communities in Peru, well, in the whole Amazon, they see as a threat REDD+, because it's commodifying air and other resources and kind of just basing it in carbon, which is not definitely the perspectives, the holistic perspectives that we need to keep learning from peoples that depend, live, and they have a deep knowledge about those places where have been living for thousands of years. So I think that exactly what our friend mentioned about stopping, I think the very important point is to address the industrialization and commodification of nature.
Thank you. Have any other question? Yes, please.
Yeah. Nice meeting you. Thank you for all. My name is Denis Ruscart. I'm a researcher, but in the past I worked for different NGOs in Guatemala, in Kenya, Indonesia, always to support indigenous peoples. But my question is more for Taylor. You know, I totally agree with you, and I really love what you explain. You know, it's so clear. And it's so clear that why it doesn't happen. And I say, why it doesn't happen? Because even today, I've seen all indigenous peoples who are having their own session alone, and then at the same time, the business explaining how they are going to save and do something on the environment at local level, totally disjunct. At the same time, after something with UNEP, with any indigenous peoples and business explaining what they are going to do to save the apes, when it's very clear that there's a direct link between biodiversity conservation, climate change, because it's where there are more carbon stock, and indigenous diversity. Then basically it's quite obvious. If you want to talk about climate change, you do that. Then I don't understand it. Could you explain to me why even it didn't happen today, here?
Can you explain?
No, I think the organizers of this session should explain. No, but I think what you're picking up on is that for us really to see solutions, we need different kinds of stakeholders to talk together and to be part of the solution together. And that's very much what our coalition is about. It's about bringing together indigenous peoples with large international organizations, with international financial organizations like the World Bank and IFAD that are funding, and UNEP that are involved in these processes at a global scale and funding a lot of the kind of programs. If you talk to indigenous peoples, they don't say we want to do this alone. They say we want to work together with the private sector. We want to work together with our own governments. We need the help of international conservation organizations, international development organizations. So I think the conditions are there for cooperation, and we certainly need it. But I think really the challenge that we face comes back to what's already been mentioned here. When we're dealing with resources that are being commodified, then you're dealing with interests and you're dealing with powers that are extremely strong and not always very inclusive. So I think that's really the big challenge that we face.
Well, it's clear that the status quo benefits to a lot of stakeholders, so that's why things are difficult to change. It's also one of the premise behind the idea of this landscape approach, is that how can you try to bring various interests, various agenda together to achieve some good. And we all know that it's not easy, because if it was that easy, we will not be here discussing this already or again. Any other question? Yes, please.
Good evening, everybody. My name is Anna Smetanova. I'm from the Laboratory of Soil Erosion in Montpellier, in France, and I would like to ask actually not only one question. First, I would start with Mr. Hunter from Australia, who has explained about the prescribed fire, as far as I understood. And I would like to ask what exactly is the cool fire, and if it's indigenous practice in Australia, if it's a traditional practice.
Yeah, look, the point about the traditional fire is that indigenous people used fire as a tool to manage their environment. And it's also the relationship that people had because they were integrated and you know, were on the land. A lot of that changed, of course. But the idea is that people have intricate cultural knowledge about their landscapes, about the animals, the flora, the fauna. There are stories, there are you know, a whole lot of knowledge that people have, a cultural knowledge. And so the process for us has been about how do you take this cultural knowledge that people have about their landscapes, about their land, and their cultural knowledge in terms of undertaking the science of doing something like carbon abatement or managing fire, using the science to estimate how to understand vegetation in a way that you can measure emissions that are created by fires, etc. So I think it's just really talking about the emerging of that knowledge in today's modern context.
Today management, in fact. Okay, thank you very much. My second question is on the speaker, which I would try to not pronounce the name because I will not do it correctly, which was speaking about the lake. I'm sorry.
No problem.
And you just said that, or you just present a very interesting shift in the social structure. I would like to ask if it's something what could be, how to say, overtaken to other areas, or it's only site-specific kind of social shift, if I can call it so.
Thank you for the question. I think that what I wanted to say with this message, that an environmental change can create also a social change or a transformation in social relations. I think this is something we need to look everywhere, but I'm sure that we will not find the same patterns everywhere, but this is something we need to be aware about it, because sometimes we think in a kind of linearity, we assume that things are happening. And what I wanted to show with this story is that we need always to question what we are doing, what we are looking at, and looking at the context where we are working. So I don't know if this same pattern of social changes or transformation will happen somewhere else. I cannot say that, but I'm sure that this is important everywhere to look at this kind of interactions. Not only people changing their environment, but also the change in the environment can change completely the social structures, as I was showing with the migration of men, and then the changes in the structure of the whole community.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you very much to all.
Thank you. Yes, please. You have a microphone also on this side.
I'd like to ask a question about food. And I don't think I've heard much being talked about how much meat we are eating. And there's more and more meat being eaten. And it's a topic that is quite hard. You can't push people to be vegan. But I think the message has been for the last 30 years, let's eat less meat, but it's not actually happening. Could you just maybe bring in your views on the matter?
I think it's maybe for Said.
I can try. I'd like to see. Just that statistic, which I think strikes everybody when you first say that 3 crops provide more than 60%, 4 crops provide more than 70% of the world's food. That's before you include animal feed. The same crops then go into animal feed, and the statistics are even more alarming. Between 80 and 90% of the direct and indirect consumption by 7 billion people is on 4 species. So I can't answer your question as to why, but I can say we're going to have a crisis when China and India particularly now take on the North American diet, and we say we haven't actually addressed what the issues are, not even from a philosophical point of view, from a health point of view, from, where I live in Malaysia now, we have the fattest country in Southeast Asia. Now, that's not a statistic to be proud of, but that means we now have replaced a generation of malnourished people with a generation of obese people in the same generation, and that is largely because of meat consumption and, of course, other dietary factors, sugars, and so it's a mindset change, which isn't just about meat eating. It's about a nourishing diet that involves diverse ingredients. Of course, I'm going to say that, but if we don't look at these plants that actually have much more nutrition in them than the big crops, we aren't going to find a way to find alternatives to meat, because we don't have other nutritious products that meat is actually a very good source of protein, for which underutilized and other fruits and vegetables have been completely passed by, because we either eat high-calorie cereals or we eat meat, and that's a very dangerous basis on which we can design agriculture and food systems of the future.
Yeah, thank you very much for your question, because the consumption of meat is the first enemy of the forest. 90% of the cause of deforestation comes from agriculture, and 70% of agricultural field go for animal feeding. So 60% of deforestation is directly linked with our consumption of meat. In what is called rich country, we eat 80 kilo of meat per year. In developing countries, 20 kilo. If we all want to eat 20 kilo, there won't be any space left. And what I think is that maybe I'm wrong, but why are cows sacred in India? Maybe because the wise men had already foreseen that if we were to eat cows, India would be totally deforested, whereas the cow is very useful while it's still alive. So I think we have to make animals sacred again, or at least more sacred, and I'm not laughing when I'm saying that. I don't know if you've heard of speciesism. It's like racism, but applied to the difference between species, where we think that we are more clever than other species, whereas we are the most dangerous species on Earth. Why? Because we are eating everybody else. So I think we have to reconsider that and raise up this question of speciesism, and as well how we treat these animals, these 60 billion animals who live horrible life and who are slaughtered every year. So thank you for raising this question.
And that without taking into account that for 1 kilogram of beef, you are consuming 1,000 of liters of water, and also without taking into account all the eutrophication of closest lakes and waters, body waters, because of all the boasts that is sounded there.
Michael?
I'm going to risk the ire of everybody and go against the grain a bit. I think part of what we need to be doing is respecting local food systems and building on those local food systems. 60% of the surface of this earth is rangelands. It's dry lands. It's mostly not suitable for agriculture, for arable agriculture, but a lot of it is very suitable for livestock production. And some of the most sustainable food production systems in these areas are to do with livestock, and mobile livestock that moves around, that copies the patterns of migratory herbivores. And so if you go right across Southern Africa, Eastern Africa, the whole of the Sahel, parts of Latin America and Australia, these really are sustainable production systems. Now, obviously, we're talking about different parts of the world, I think. I think we don't want to increase food miles by taking this meat and bringing it to Europe, but I think part of it, this respect for local production systems, involves the recognition of the importance of meat in those kind of environments.
I think the meat issue is a clear one. Clearly, there is a large part of the world that is eating way too much meat, and clearly another part which is not enough. Meat is a nutrient-dense food, so it's meat, milk, it's essential.
Yeah,
with the quantity we consume in our Western country are probably, surely, way, way, way too much. So I guess it's more the fact to say that maybe there should be some sort of a reduction in one side and better management in the other one. Uriah, you want to say something?
Just to add a little bit to what Michael was saying, we need to make a difference between the system we use to produce this meat. And I totally agree with you that pastoralists and pastoral systems are also local systems who are actually, when you look at them in terms of adaptation to climate change, they are the one who were most adapted to climate change, because they move from one region to other region, and this time you have the regeneration of the natural resources, and they use some areas where you can do nothing else, and they provide livelihoods, they provide food security. But this is, I think we need to make the difference between the intensification of livestock. Are we talking about this one, or are we talking about the extensive livestock, which is also an indigenous and also a local production system we need also to respect? So I think we need to make a little bit of differentiation when we talk about meat.
Maybe we differentiate more, because meat is not meat, and there's other sources of animal protein, such as fish. And if we actually look at aquaculture systems, which is the biggest growing source of animal protein in the world, is aquaculture, and we're looking at aquaculture as the most unregulated source of protein. And we still have the same ideas of feeding fish with fish. We're feeding fish with fish meal and fish oil, and what are the other ingredients? Maize and soya and wheat and barley. And you go, isn't this a not very clever way to use food crops to feed fish, when we actually can see fish as a very high quality source of protein, which could be fed with insects? One of the research projects we're looking at is insect meal for fish, simply because we don't want to put more and more pressure on the big crops, and we do want to find local sources of plentiful ingredients that we can put into aquaculture systems much closer to the consumer. So I don't think we should just put meat into one bracket. I think meat has different uses.
Well, humanity has a tendency not to listen very much about the lesson. You know, sort of, we have been feeding cows with cows, and the result was not very good, if I recall. No. Any last question? Yes? Yes, please. You can go to the microphone.
My name is Oluwashina from Nigeria, but I study in Javelin. My question is that Anade says an ugly man is an ugly lion. In some cases in which someone is hungry, then you are given an initiation that maybe stop deforestation, stop this, stop that. What measure is being given for food to be provided for the hungry man? Because I can say in some developing countries, due to lack of employment, insufficient fund. Majority of the youth have gone into illegal logging activities in order to get food for their daily means. But the NGO are coming to the developing country to orientate the youth, but the more they preach to them, the more they emphasize on it, the more we still discover that the trend of deforestation is increasing. Let me use, I'm from Nigeria as an example. Majority of the youth go into logging activities in order for them to get food. The government are preaching, the NGO are preaching, but I can see, despite their preaching, shouting, it's not actually manifesting. I now want to ask, what measure is being put in place for this, for, shall I say, a change or for an improvement for each of them to get food on their table?
Yes, thank you.
Yeah, I think that is the essence or the promise of a landscape approach that is multi-stakeholder. Instead of forcing an agenda on a landscape, it's the people, the companies, the governments of those regions sitting together and make a joint plan in which every stakeholder can then recognize themselves. And sometimes there will be a process of negotiation, and there are trade-offs, and there are tough decisions that need to be made. But in terms of all the different governance options that we've explored in the past, at least it's not forcing a top-down agenda on people that they will then not be willing to swallow and accept. I think that also relates maybe to the previous discussion around consumption of meat, or what livestock system is suitable for what location. I think it's really up to that landscape and people to find appropriate solutions.
Actually, I had forestry background, and this implementation, what you said, has been implemented and is being carried out every time to time in Nigeria, but we still discover, as at now, the trend of deforestation is getting higher. Because on my research, I work on logging effect on residual plants. We discover rate of deforestation at the free area, even the reserve area, in which government has politicized that nobody should encroach. We discover rate of encroachment is getting higher despite where we are preaching, we are talking, government is making more efforts and the NGO are working, but this is not improving. But because as at moment, the rate of unemployment in Nigeria, even in Africa and some developing countries, is getting higher. We have many graduates, after their bachelor or whatever, they couldn't have food on their table. And they want means, they can't go into stealing and criminal activities, but just to find means of employing themselves. Some just say, oh, we have the resources, let me just go in. So what are the measures? Are the NGO really looking at this aspect, this effect? Is it yielding? It's just like, are we talking on top of our voice? Is it really being implemented? What is the government doing to make this to make it achieved? Because of all the preaching and everything, we discover rate of deforestation per se, Nigeria, for example, is becoming higher and higher, no improvement up to date. And we are working on it, funding are going on it, just to restore the environment. The question is that, is the environment really being restored? And actually, the youth have some mentalities. They will say, like, they say you follow the path of your leader. The leader, themselves, they are living in the city, but they want the youth to go back to the forest. Are they really encouraged to go back to the forest? Is a question. So what are the measures being taken for it to be achieved? And the preaching.
I think that you are posing way too much questions for us to be able to answer in something like 2 minutes that are left to us. But clearly, I mean, yes, that's the sort of, you have somewhat summarized the issue of sustainable development, which is not something that we are going to solve tonight, but which is something we hope to contribute to, and through this, we hope that we will get as a result of the COP21. It's 9 p.m. I think we have all had a very long day. That was a very fruitful day. I think I was quite impressed by the quality of the presentation, by their interest. I think we should all give a big round of applause to our... We could also give ourselves a big round of applause for still being here at 9 o'clock. And thank you very much, and see you tomorrow for another eventful day.